Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome along. It is good to see you. Hey, if we've never met before, my name's Clint, and it really is a privilege to have you with us today. Today, we're starting a brand new series, and we've entitled it Walking Through the Shadows. And this series really is all about helping us walk through pain and walk through suffering with the evil and everything that exists in our world. And the reason that we're doing this series is kind of twofold, to be honest. One is that when we look across the church and theology that's been taught, especially in the Western church over the last number of years now, that we really haven't got a good theology of what it looks like to suffer. In fact, what a lot of churches will push and what a lot of Christians will say is, hey, if I just pray and I just praise God, all of that will go away. But we've called this series Walking Through the Shadows because actually we need to walk through the shadows. There's even a biblical reference in there that some of you might have picked up on, and we'll get to that later in the series. But we've got to walk through the shadows. See, sometimes we can see the shadows, and we can try and walk away from the shadows thinking, if I don't go there, I'm never going to have to face pain and suffering. But I love this quote. It says, when suffering knocks at your door, and you say there is no seat for him, he tells you not to worry because he brought his own stool. That's true, right? We wish we could get through this life without pain and suffering, but hey, pain and suffering is all around us. The second reason we're sort of doing this series is last year, Nathan Schofield, he's chairs our elders, and he's one of the smartest guys, and I don't want to embarrass him, but he's so wise. And he sort of shared with us these thoughts about the way that the world is sort of looking, and that over the last number of years, almost since the last World War, there's been one big superpower in the world that by and large has controlled the way that the world is looking, and it's created a really peaceful sort of world. But what we're seeing happen in the world at the moment is other superpowers are emerging, that we're seeing cost of living go through the roof, and that looks like as different superpowers emerge and trying to take this position on the global scale, that there might be fractions that appear around the world, and that's just going to keep putting cost of living up, because rather than the world being one big place that's working together, it's going to get fractured, and different places are going to work together, and it just paints quite a bleak picture of potentially what could happen over the next sort of 10, 20, 30 years as different things transpire around the world. And again, we haven't got time to go into that, saying I'm not the smartest person to take you through that sort of stuff. But the picture was that, hey, we potentially are heading into some times that are just more painful and more hard for humanity than what we've experienced over this long period of peace. So he said, hey, well, we've actually got to prepare ourselves for what might be some difficult times ahead. But we all know that even when the world at large is kind of in this place of peace, that pain and suffering is still a very real part of our world. And again, because of who's in the room here today, a lot of us would say, hey, that pain and suffering can serve a purpose. Helen Keller, who you might have heard of because she has one quote that's so well known about, hey, I'd rather be blind and have no vision. I'd rather have vision and be blind than have vision and have no vision. I got it all wrong, but you know the quote, eh? There's too many words. Come on, Clint, sort your life out, mate. You know the one that I'm talking about. She said this, and as someone who was blind growing up when she grew up, she said, character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved. That there's something about suffering that brings the best out in us. And a lot of us have seen that. A lot of us have experienced that. In fact, many of us have looked into Christianity or become Christians because we've seen someone who's going through something so difficult. But they were so resolute and strong in their faith that we said, what is it about them that's different? I want that level of certainty. I want that level of conviction in my life. And we've got to walk through the shadows. Walking away from them, and we can't do, they're going to catch up to us. That suffering will bring its own stool. And then one last quote here, which again I think is very, very powerful, very short. I've got this one written so I can get it perfect. Man cannot remake himself without suffering, for he is both the marble and the sculptor. How profound is that? That we are both the one being sculpted by suffering, yet we too are the one that are often the cause of the suffering because of our actions on other people. So we live in a Western culture that encourages us to run through the shadows, to get through it as fast as we possibly can. In the Western culture, we want an instant fix, instant gratification, get through it, just let this season pass. But again, for people that have had to endure some incredible things in their life, some massive pains and huge sufferings, you know that you can't just run through it. And I have to say, off the bat, as we go into the series, this is a challenging series for me in the fact I know a lot of the stories of people that are in this room. And the level of pain and the level of suffering and the level of difficulty that you have had to endure far exceeds any level of pain and any level of suffering that I've had to endure. And I just, because part of my role, you just hear these stories. And so I feel like I'm not that well equipped to be up here talking about this, knowing some of the people that are in the room. And yet I'm going to, because one thing that I've found is that all of us have faced some levels of pain and some level of suffering. And then I once got told off because I was in an environment, I was in this room, there was a guy that had come to share with a small group of us. There was about 30 of us, and he was just talking about trauma and the amount of trauma that people are carrying today and how people aren't processing trauma very well. And he stood up and he shared his story. And his story was one about how his son had lost his life through cot death, obviously as a little infant. And then he shared the story, and then he paused, and then he says to the room of us, how do you feel about this? And talking about this, what do you think? And part of his idea was to help us sort of process some stuff and talk through some stuff, and I don't know, I understand all the stuff that's going on. And I just said, well, I kind of feel like I've got nothing in my life to complain about, because that's never happened to me. And if I think of the worst thing that's happened to me, it's like a fraction of what you've had to endure and what that's had. And he actually said, no, that's not actually true. That's my story, and that story is very different than your story. But all of us have got some level of pain, that all of us have had to suffer, and all of us have had to face difficulty at some time. And I think what can happen when we talk about these sort of things is we can always look at that person who's had to go through this, and that person who's had to go through this, and then that person who's gone through this and this and this and this and this. Yet what we've got to understand is that all of us, as we go through this life, are going to have to walk through the shadows. And so what we want to do over the series, it's 4 weeks long, is each week I'm going to invite someone up to actually share their story and what walking through the shadows was like for them. And I just think this is going to be a really, really powerful time. And so today I'd like to invite Jono up, who's going to share for a few moments about his story of walking through the shadows.
Morning, church. For those who don't know me, my name is Jono. I get the privilege of leading the youth here at Life Church. But this is a part of my story, and I think suffering is present wherever you look. It seems to be a common part of the human experience. What I have suffered and what you have suffered may be totally different circumstances, yet we can empathize with each other. So my story comes about, much like most stories, while in the middle of life, a crisis happens. It was a regular day back at Otaki College. I was in year 9, and I was in maths class, and the deputy principal comes into the room, and he says, "Is Jonathan Chaplow in here?" And I was like, "Oh my goodness, what have I done?" And he asked to see me in his office. Now, I was a pretty nerdy tryhard at school, and so I was panicking about what I had done wrong. This was a first for me. It was not a regular occasion for me to be summoned to the deputy principal's office. And he was quite stoic, is one thing that I noticed as we were walking along. This raises my nerves even more. We walk down the hallway towards his office, and he opens the door. In there sits my mum, my sister, my grandma, and my grandpa, all 4 dishevelled, red-eyed, and upset. My heart doesn't know how to react, and my mum just looks at me, heart ripped out of her chest. I can see it in her eyes. Grandpa looks to me and says, "Johnny, your dad's passed away." My brain goes into turmoil. I always think that this will be easier to talk about as time goes on, But even to this day, I still suffer from the loss of that day. It's the little things. Some of you might think of it as big things that open the wound like it was just yesterday, like wishing that he could meet his beautiful granddaughter. Having walked my little sister down the aisle, I had the privilege of taking his place, but that was his rightful place to walk her down. And see me grow up, see the man that have become, and see who my sister is. And that day was the start of a lot of things. I really struggled with faith in those coming years. I'd just been baptized at the time, and so I was really glad that Dad got to see that. But I wrestled with the thoughts after the days that Dad had passed away, and we came up with a running joke that God must have had IT issues, and that's why Dad had to go to glory before we thought it was his time. I knew that I couldn't argue with God's authority nor his timing. Who am I to know God's plans? All I knew was that I missed my dad. This underlying thought led me to so much struggle. Why would God let Dad die so early? I wrestled with that. When I read my Bible, I wrestled with that. When I worship in church, I wrestled with that. When I sat alone in the quiet, I wrestled. And that is why, slowly, it chipped away at me. For I could not come up with a good reason. I just missed my dad. I knew that I had a heavenly Father, but I shied away from him because I was grieving. I was suffering. My dad was my best friend. We did everything together. He left his career so that he could spend more time with us kids. He even got a job at the same school that we went to so that he could be as present as possible. Through loss, I lost sight of God. Though I was struggling, he did not abandon me. I just stopped reaching out to him. And in that, I found despair, sorrow, anguish, and heartbreak. To which I played the avoidance card, classic 13-year-old. I went back to school 2 days later after he had passed away. I ended up changing schools that year to push for a higher education because that just helped me avoid things even more. I played sports. I got lost in video games. I had friends stay over, anything that I could do to avoid being alone. I would busy myself around home. Holding the new title, man of the house, meant that I felt like I had to stand up to that. And avoidance was a resting place for me because it meant that I could just be. It took me over a year to reconnect again with God. In doing so, I found that God's heart was close to mine. In Psalms 34:18, it says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed." I could look back and see his hand patiently waiting to catch me when I was ready to let go. It just took time. And I know that sometimes they say time is the best healer. But the reality is that suffering is still present. And it's still present in life as we go forward, even though we came to understand more. I could look back and see God guiding me to a safe place to grieve. And I uphold that still. For not a year goes by when I do not still be still and honor both Dad and God on my dad's anniversary of him passing. I know that through my suffering, I have a connection to God that goes far beyond emotional understanding. I know that in the deepest valleys, he is there. And where he walks, the light will always overcome the darkness. Only he is the great comforter. Only he, the Prince of Peace. Only he is the great I am. I may never get an answer to why I lost my dad, but I know that I trust God, and I know that God is always faithful, and that he is always good.
Man, Jono, thanks for your vulnerability, bro. And I think that's what we can often do, right? With pain and with suffering is where we can put it into a back corner. We don't often hear stories like this. And yet, these stories are very present in all of our lives. So thanks, man, for just sharing so vulnerably and real, honestly. And I think what's scary about life, hey, is we want to pretend the shadows don't exist. And it's like if we don't talk about the shadows, they're not there. And so as we go into a topic like this, it's so real and it's so big because for all of us as we go through life, those shadows are there. And in fact, in this upcoming week, they're having a funeral in here on Tuesday for I think she was a 28-year-old woman who was hit in a hit and run just down in Taita last week. It's like, how do you process that? We know that there's stories of people who get terminal diagnosis. We hear and we read accounts of little children who are so innocent and sweet, yet they get a diagnosis that says they've only got months to live. We hear stories of people that have tried their absolute best, yet have gone bankrupt and lose everything, not necessarily because they've done something wrong, but because of other people's deception. That pain and suffering is such a real part of the human story. And what I want to do, and then the minutes that we have remaining today, I'm going to switch hats a little bit. I'm going to teach a little bit differently. I want to teach a little bit more intellectually today than what I normally do. And the reason for that is this, is when it comes to pain and suffering, there's a lot of Christian cliches around. And for those of us that are already convinced God is who He is, that He is on the throne, that He is all powerful, that He is in control, those Christian cliches can mean something because we believe that He is God. We believe that He's all powerful. But for a lot of other people, they actually don't answer anything. In fact, those cliches can offer more questions. And I think if we're really going to talk about pain and suffering in a proper way, in a meaningful way, in a way that's going to help all of us not just deal with pain and suffering, but maybe to get alongside others who are working through pain and suffering, is it's got to have a lot of intellectual rigor to it. Because otherwise it's just meaningless words that sound nice together. Maybe they rhyme. Maybe they've seen them on the cards before. Or maybe they've been thrown out by preachers on stages like this. But we want to have a little bit more rigor than that as we talk about walking through pain and suffering. And so what I want to do is take you through a few different worldviews. And to give credit, there's a couple of books that I've read over the last wee while that have really helped form the basis of this. And there's a lot of literature out there, but these are the two of the best ones. The first one is an old one. It's by C.S. Lewis, and it's called The Problem with Pain. And honestly, if you read a C.S. Lewis book, it takes a long time to read a C.S. Lewis book. I read a lot of books. But like, man, that guy is intellectual. And you read a page and you have to reread the page and you have to reread the page. Maybe that's just me. But I've done a lot of reading in my time, and so I think I'm not too bad. And the other one's by Tim Keller. And Tim Keller's book is called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And so those have heavily shaped, especially Tim Keller's stuff that we're saying today. So if I get anything wrong, just blame Tim Keller, okay? That's my out here. But what Tim Keller suggests, and he puts out there, is that all cultures, that ever since the beginning of time, all cultures have come up with a narrative, a story that explains pain and suffering. That in order to get through life, cultures have had to come up with a story that they tell themselves about pain and about suffering. And what I want to do is just highlight sort of four big ones, and then I'll take a quick moment at the end and talk about the current culture that we're in secularism and what that says about pain and suffering, and then I'll flip it around to Christianity to help you see, because what I believe is Christianity is the only worldview that can answer some of these questions in a meaningful way, a way that gives us hope, a way that allows us to grieve deeply yet still have a hope for the future. And so the first culture I want to look at, and then again, just to taking these highlights that Keller gave, and because they sort of give a highlight profile, is the first one's a moralistic culture. That a lot of cultures are moralistic. And in fact, even for a lot of people that when they look at Christianity from an external perspective who don't really understand what Christianity is, they would look at it from a moralistic point of view. And then the example of this culture is a culture where karma is real present. That if you did that, this is the result of what you did. And in a moralistic culture, that the cause of pain and suffering is because of wrongdoing. You did something wrong, now you're paying for it. You ripped that person off, therefore you've got sick. We actually see this in one of Jesus' accounts where there's a blind man, and people say, what sin has he done that led him to this? Or what sin of his parents have led him to be blind? Jesus is like, don't be silly. It's got nothing to do with that. But in a moralistic worldview, if someone's going through pain, if someone's going through suffering, if someone's in that sort of space, it's because they've done something wrong. That their response needs to be, you've got to be someone who does good. If you do better, you'll have less pain. If you're a better person, if you live by these principles, if you don't break these rules, if you don't break these commandments, if you don't break these laws, you're going to have a good life. And then the resolution, the end result of this is, hey, if you live good enough, you'll get to a place of eternal bliss. So you can see how a lot of people look at Christianity and think that's what Christianity is, right? Because isn't Christianity a list of rules of do's and don'ts? And if I don't do those things and I do those things, I'm going to get in God's good books? Not at all. That's not Christianity. That is not biblical Christianity at all. It's a moralistic look at the world. And so a moralistic society would see people who are going through pain, who are going through suffering, and their suggestion to them would be, hey, you just need to act differently. You need to act differently because you need to be better. Another popular one is around this idea of being self-transcendent. That you've got to get above your pain and your suffering. And the example here is Buddhism. And Buddhism and people that subscribe to, or cultures that subscribe to a self-transcendent view, that they'd say that pain is simply, and suffering is an illusion. That actually, yes, while we are here in this material world, everything in this material world is just an illusion. That it's not real. We've got to train our mind to get to a higher place. And so the response in these cultures is you've got to detach yourself from the pain and suffering that's going around. And anyone who's lost someone close to them can see the challenges with this, right? Because you can't just detach yourself from something like that. And the thinking here is if I detach myself and I can see all of this material world as simply being an illusion, I'm going to get to this enlightened place. And so the application in a society that self-transcendent will just be, hey, in order to get through pain and suffering, what you need to do, you don't have to act differently, but you need to think differently. Then there's societies or cultures that would be fatalistic. And fatalistic are the people that would just say, hey, this is just the way it is. There is nothing you can do about it. This is the cultures that often like shame and honor cultures. And so that'll be like, man, if you're going to go through pain, you're going to go through suffering, you've got to be strong, you've got to be brave, you've got to be tough, you've just got to bite that lip and suck it up and get through it. Because if you go through this well, then it's going to reflect well on your family. It's going to bring honor to your family and your lineage that's to come. But if you go through this poorly, if you go through the pain and suffering with too much show of grief or showing too much heartbreak, showing too much hurt, showing too much brokenness, then that's going to bring shame to your family. And so their response really, their cause is this is just what happens, this is destiny, it's meant to happen. The response is just to be strong, show endurance to get through it. The resolution, if you do, is glory and honor to your family. And so people in these cultures would say, if you're going through a difficult time, just toughen up. Have the concrete pill. Be strong, keep pushing, you'll get there. And then the fourth big culture to look at here is what Carla calls the dualistic culture. And this is culture where it talks about there being darkness and there being light. And then the culture and the idea has been that some people are inherently good and some people are inherently bad. That some things are inherently good and some things are inherently bad. And that there's this big battle going on between light and dark, between good and evil. And everything in and of itself is either good or evil. And so they'd say that the cause of all our pain and suffering is this cosmic conflict that's going on. That the response to people just needs to be purified faithfulness, because we are people who are inherently, you're either a person who's inherently good or bad. So if I'm an inherently good person, I've just got to purify myself to be incredibly faithful to the light. The resolution is that one day light will triumph over darkness, so there is a hope somewhere in the future. And again, when you understand Christianity, you can say, hey, there's a little bit of Christianity in this, right? Because Christianity talks about the lightness and the darkness. But the big difference between a dualistic worldview and a Christian worldview is the Christian worldview that actually understands that in the inside of you and in the inside of me, there's the ability for good and evil. Because I know you and you probably know me. You know enough about me to know that this Clint's probably done some good in his life. But you also know that I've also done some evil in my life. That the line between good and evil isn't between two people, but actually runs through every human heart. So you got these four sort of big worldviews, these big cultures, the way that they help their people process and look through pain and suffering. And what these four cultures have in common is really quite special and really quite unique, is all of them actually point to a larger purpose for pain and suffering. Whether it's bringing honor to your family or bringing shame to your family, as we saw. Whether it's this idea that one day light's going to overcome darkness, so man, there's this purpose beyond me that's worth me suffering and worth me enduring this pain. Or whether the moralistic one is if I'm just good enough, one day I'm going to get to this place of eternal bliss. Or as Carmen might suggest, if I keep getting better and better and better, one day I won't be reincarnated as something, but I'll actually get to that place of perfect bliss. Whereas the challenge we have with the secular worldview, which I'll talk about in just a moment, is this. And in a secular worldview, there is no purpose beyond this material world. And in a truly secular worldview, is all there is the here and now. There is the material of this world, and that's it. When life ends, it's over. And so anyone who subscribes to one of those other four worldviews, or to Christianity, there can be purpose in our suffering. But if you have a true secular worldview, you cannot attach a deeper purpose to your pain and suffering. Because the purpose of your life is to be successful, is to be happy, is to have fun, is to get the most out of the here and the now. And what does suffering do? Suffering not only hurts you in the here and now, but if your purpose in life is to get the most out of the here and the now, suffering just doesn't attack you as a person, but it actually takes away your meaning for life. A lot of sociologists, they'll suggest that one of the reasons that there is so much problem in our world today, in Western society today, with things on the mental health spectrum, to do with suicide or to do with challenges, why should I live, is because we've got this worldview in secular society today that says, hey, life is just about the here and the now. And if there's too much pain and there's too much suffering in the here and now, I've got no greater purpose in life. What's the point of me living? One thing that we've said around here for a while, right, when we've talked about mental health and trying to do the work that we're doing sort of in that space, is this idea that we've been saying to generations now for quite a while, that if we say to a generation, you come from nowhere, you live for no purpose, and you're going nowhere when you die, why do we get upset when they live like that? We've got to change the narrative. We've got to tell every single person that you were created on purpose, that you were created for a purpose, and you've actually been created for an eternal life in heaven. If we can start to change that script that young people are being told, we'll start to change the way that they think, which will change the way that they live. And we've got to do that. This is to help you understand the secular worldview. Here's a quote from Richard Dawkins in his book. Hey, you never thought I'd quote Richard Dawkins in church, did you? In his book, River Out of Eden. Richard Dawkins is one of the biggest atheists out there, and he wrote the book called The God Delusion. He says this, he says, the total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observed has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. He's really saying that there is no point whatsoever to pain and suffering. It's just there, it's going to happen, and there's nothing we can do about it. And if we embrace this secular way of thinking, the secular way of life, that we can't say that there's purpose in pain. We can't say that there's anything good that can come out of the suffering that we endure, that it just is. If we were to put secularism up on the screen here, like we looked at those other worldviews, we would say that, hey, what's the cause of pain and suffering in a secular worldview? It's just an accident. It just happened. It's an accident. What's our response to suffering? We've just got to find a technique that's going to help alleviate this suffering. There's just got to be a technique there. And what's going to be the resolution? If we can get enough techniques out there and we can identify what all the right techniques are, the resolution is going to be we just have to create a better society. Yes, the people in it are going to have the right techniques, but as we get more advanced, as we get smarter, we're just going to create a better society that's going to remove or reduce the pain and the suffering. The application to how we embrace pain and suffering with a secular worldview is really we've got to remove the cause. We've got to remove the cause. So when it comes to pain and suffering, a secular worldview really is, and one author puts it this way, that they say that the final solution is when you die, there is no more pain and there is no suffering. That's the best that secularism can hope for. That's the end scenario. One day you're all going to die. And when you die, you're going to not exist anywhere. You're going to be nowhere. So therefore, there's going to be no more pain and there's going to be no more suffering. Not that hope-inspiring, is it? Not that encouraging as you're working through a position of pain and suffering. A writer called Luke Ferry, who wrote a book called A Brief History of Thought. This guy isn't even a Christian. This guy, he'd say he's a secularist. He says this. He says, exploiting what it saw as a weakness in Greek wisdom, Christianity created a new doctrine of salvation, so effective it opened up a chasm in the philosophies of antiquity and dominated the Western world for nearly 1,500 years. Christianity would seem to be the only version of salvation that enables us to not only transcend the fear of death, but also to beat death itself. This is a philosopher who's looked at all these worldviews and trying to come to a conclusion on where this stuff sits. He says Christianity is the only worldview that enables us to beat the fear of death and also to beat death itself. The crazy part about this, the cool part about this is early Christian writers and speakers, they not only argued vigorously, Christianity's teaching made sense of suffering and pain. The way that they lived their lives actually showed that they really did believe this stuff. That Christianity doesn't just give you this hope for the future. It doesn't just give you the framework maybe to understand what pain and suffering could do. But when they looked at the lives that the early Christians lived, they say, man, pain and suffering was a big part of their world. And look at the way they got through it. Keller gives us these four core essential Christian beliefs that enable us. I'm going to take you through these really, really quick. Because then we've got a little exercise I want you to do before we get out of here. But four Christian views that are essential, four Christian doctrines, four Christian beliefs that sit at the core of what we believe as Christians. That give us hope for the future. And again, we'll dive into some of the stuff in a more inspiring and a more helpful and a more hands-on way as we go through the series. But the first of these Christian beliefs is this. We have a personal, all-knowing, all-powerful, always present God who is in control. There's a level of comfort that comes with that we have an all-knowing, always present, all-powerful God who is in control. The second one, and this is huge, that in Jesus, God came to earth and He suffered with us and He suffered for us sacrificially. Do you know that no other religion can point to a suffering God? No other religion can point to a God who suffers. But in Jesus, we've got a God who's known as the suffering servant. He was known as the man of sorrows. He was filled with compassion when He looked out and He saw people who were like sheep without a shepherd. He gets your grief. The shortest verse in the Bible, favorite one to memorize. A whole lot of people might know it, a whole lot won't. You'll know it in just a second, you'll never forget it. Jesus wept. Shortest verse. Filled with compassion. He gets your grief. He suffered the way that you and I suffer. He's not removed from our suffering. He's endured our suffering. God lost a son. Jesus faced a huge injustice when he got put on that cross. Do you know what level of suffering and pain comes when you're faced an injustice and you can't get out of it and you can't have those tables turned? That is, man, there's a huge amount of suffering and pain that comes with that, just as they're bigger with losing your own child. Jesus had been betrayed by those who were closest to him. He had those he loved turn his back on him. He endured pain and suffering. That's a fundamental Christian belief that sits at the heart of what we believe. The third one, through faith in Christ's work on the cross, we can have assurance of our salvation. Because of what Christ did on the cross, we can be assured of salvation. We can be assured of our eternal life. And fourth, and we're running through this real quick. This is powerful stuff. We'll get to one day. Fourth, there is a bodily resurrection from the dead for all who believe. There is a bodily resurrection from the dead for all who believe. That the Christian concept of heaven isn't just like, oh yeah, there's all these spirits floating in the sky and it's going to be this real nice place of just bliss. But what we're promised is that one day we will be part of the new heavens and the new earth. That we will have a new body. That there will be no more tears. That pain and suffering will be wiped away. That it will be gone. That it will be done. That is our hope for the future. You see, next week we're going to tackle this question. And if you were here, and as I was going through this probably came to your mind. We're going to tackle this question. If you believe there is a God who is all-powerful and sovereign over all the world and at the same time is also perfectly good and just, then why is there pain and suffering in the world? We're going to take that next week. We're going to help you understand that. But the reason I wanted us to do that this week rather than jumping straight into that big question is simply this. If we'd begun with that traditional problem of evil against the existence of God, I would have really given the impression that only belief in a traditional God is challenged by the existence of pain and suffering. Most people who see the problems that suffering poses and presents to a belief in God move more towards a secular way of thinking. But as we've talked about, secularism is also a set of beliefs. And in fact, it is probably the weakest of all the worldviews at helping those who subscribe to it understand and endure the pain and the suffering that comes with a human life. And while I admit, there's still some big questions that we need to ask. And while there can still be a little bit of disconnect between this idea that there is an always present, always powerful, good God that allows pain and suffering to occur in this world, I suggest and I put it to us that when we really understand that, Christianity punches well above any other worldview and secularism by a mile when it comes down to answering that question. You see, if we're going to use this question, this idea that there is a powerful God, who is a good God, who allows pain and suffering to take us away from Christianity, that's actually taking us towards something. And that something else isn't a place we want to go. And if we're going to scrutinize Christianity with some questions, we've got to scrutinize everything else. Because what we'll see is Christianity stacks up so well. Well, what we're going to do, we've got some little cards here to pass around. And we sung before about making just a little bit of space. And as these cards come along, what we want to do right now is just create a couple of moments. And you can read, all I've done on this card is highlight the stuff that I've talked about today. On the back of it, there's a few questions for you to ponder. And again, you're not going to have the time right now to ponder these questions. They're too big, they're too meaningful. But my hope, my prayer is that maybe over the coming week, you'll be able to find some space to ponder these questions, to ask these questions, and reflect, and come back next week as we look at that big question. So, hey, just get this card, reflect for a couple of moments,